الله أكبر تعال مدام مدام.
At a time when much of the world's attention is fixed on the Middle East, the United States is sending a very different signal to Asia. Not a signal of retreat, not a signal of hesitation, but a signal that the Indo-Pacific front is still being guarded, still being watched, and still being armed. That is precisely why the 2026 Balikatan joint exercise in the Philippines is far more important than just another annual military drill. Because while Washington is being pulled into war with Iran and mounting pressure in other regions, its decision to proceed with a massive exercise in Asia involving more than 17,000 personnel feels like a hard message. America has not let go of Asia. And the question now is this: is this truly proof of strategic commitment, or is it a sign that Washington is being forced to operate across too many fronts at once?
Balikatan 2026 will take place from April 20th to May 8th, 2026, across multiple areas of the Philippine archipelago. This is the 41st iteration of the exercise, whose name itself means shoulder to shoulder. But this year, its scale is much larger, and its political meaning is much sharper. According to the Associated Press, the exercise is being held at a time when the United States is heavily preoccupied with the Middle East, yet it is still being presented as proof of Washington's strong commitment to Asia. Reuters also reported that this is no longer just a routine bilateral exercise, but one of the most complex training operations ever conducted, with a clear focus on regional readiness and an ironclad commitment to the Philippines as a treaty ally. From the beginning then, Balikatan 2026 was never geopolitically neutral. It is a display of presence, a display of readiness, and most importantly, a display of American strategic endurance. In terms of numbers, the message is unmistakable. An official release from I-Marine Expeditionary Force states that more than 17,000 personnel from the Philippines, the United States, Australia, Japan, Canada, France, and New Zealand will take part in the exercise. On top of that, 17 other nations are participating as international observers. Balikatan 2026 also coincides with the 75th anniversary of the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, meaning the historical symbolism has been deliberately amplified. In a format like this, the exercise is no longer just about battlefield tactics. It is about the region's emerging security architecture. The more countries become involved, the stronger the message becomes. The Philippines does not stand alone, and the South China Sea is no longer seen merely as a local dispute, but as a test case for the credibility of alliances.
So, why has this exercise become so sensitive? Because the location, the scenario, and the timing all point to one thing: China. AP reported that during this year's drills, Japanese forces will fire missiles in a ship-sinking scenario in waters northwest of the Philippines, facing directly toward the South China Sea. Reuters added that Japan will use the Type 88 surface-to-ship missile system, making this live-fire role highly symbolic. At the same time, the exercise includes air, land, sea, cyber, coastal defense, integrated air and missile defense, and counter-drone operations. In other words, Balikatan 2026 is simulating the kind of modern warfare that is most relevant to maritime Asia today. This is no longer an old-style military drill. It is a simulation of a region being prepared for the possibility of a major crisis. But what makes this angle especially interesting is not just China, it is America itself. Because, according to AP's reporting on the impact of the Iran war on Asia, Washington's allies in the region are beginning to worry that the conflict in the Middle East is pulling American assets, focus, and ammunition stockpiles away from the Indo-Pacific. That report noted concerns over the possible redeployment of U.S. military assets, including missile defense systems from South Korea and rapid response marine units from Japan. There were also warnings that the longer the conflict in the Middle East continues, the greater the risk that America's focus and resources will be diverted away from Asia, while weapons deliveries to the region could also slow down. This is exactly where Balikatan 2026 becomes so important. The exercise is not just about training allies, but also about reassuring them. Washington is essentially saying, yes, we are busy elsewhere, but we have not left this region.
The problem is that a political signal is not always the same thing as real capacity. The presence of troops in a military exercise certainly matters psychologically, but the deeper question is whether the United States can sustain readiness across two fronts over the long term. Recent history shows that America's so-called pivot to Asia has been repeatedly disrupted by crises in other regions, and now that pattern appears once again. As the Middle East consumes more attention, Asia is once again being forced to ask whether it remains a true top priority or merely a priority in speeches. In that sense, Balikatan 2026 can be seen as an emergency answer, not proof that every problem is solved, but proof that Washington understands that if it fails to show up now, Beijing will interpret that vacuum as an opportunity. On the ground, that urgency is also reflected in the Philippines itself. On April 9, 2026, AP reported that the Philippines opened a major Coast Guard base on Titu Island, or Pagasa, in the South China Sea. The move was described as a sentinel of sovereignty in waters that are closely watched by China. On the same day, the Philippine Coast Guard accused Chinese forces of firing flares toward a Philippine patrol aircraft near Subi Reef and Mischief Reef. AP also reminded readers that China's sweeping claims in the South China Sea were invalidated by the 2016 International Arbitration ruling, but Beijing has rejected that decision and continues to press its claims. For Manila, then, Balikatan is not simply an exercise of friendship. It is a military drill being held while real friction is unfolding at sea, in the air, and in the political arena. The Philippines is strengthening its position, and the United States is arriving to ensure that strengthening effort does not look isolated.
At this point, the broader picture becomes clear. The United States wants to show that even while it is engaged or constrained in the Middle East, it is still capable of protecting its alliance chain in the Indo-Pacific. The Philippines is the ideal stage for that message. First, because the Philippines sits on the front line of the South China Sea. Second, because Manila is becoming increasingly open to deeper military cooperation. Third, because the involvement of Japan, Canada, France, Australia, and New Zealand makes the exercise look like a miniature regional coalition. In other words, Washington appears to be trying to reduce its dependence on unilateral American presence and promote a new model, distributing the burden of regional security across a wider network of allies. So the real message is not just America is still here, but also America is building an ecosystem so that Asia can remain resilient even when Washington is pulled into another theater. Of course, Beijing will not view this as a normal exercise. From China's perspective, live fire drills near the South China Sea, the expansion of Philippine bases, and the visible symbolism of a multinational alliance will clearly look like a gradual strategy of encirclement. That is why Balikatan 2026 could also increase the risk of misreading, miscalculation, and overreaction. When one side describes this as a defensive exercise, the other may interpret it as a rehearsal for limited war. And in an era of drones, anti-ship missiles, coastal defense systems, and gray zone conflict, that kind of misreading can be extremely costly. That is why this exercise is not only about military strength, but also about messaging. A message to allies, do not panic. A message to adversaries, do not test us. And a message to the world, Asia has not lost its priority in Washington's strategic vision.
So, has America really not let go of Asia? For now, the answer appears to be not yet. Balikatan 2026 is visual proof that Washington still wants to stand in front of its allies in the Indo-Pacific, even while its war in the Middle East consumes attention, assets, and ammunition. But the real test is still ahead, because one large military exercise can send a strong message for a few weeks, while strategic rivals measure power over years. If conflicts in other regions continue draining American focus, Asia will eventually judge the United States not by how many troops show up for an exercise, but by how consistent its support remains when a real crisis erupts. And that leads to the biggest question of all. Is Balikatan 2026 proof that America still holds Asia firmly? Or is it actually a sign that Washington is struggling hard to make sure Asia does not feel abandoned? Write your opinion in the comment section.